reminder. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event, Activism and Publishing with the collective ReFramed. This event this afternoon is programmed as part of Impressions Gallery online photo book fair. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Anne McNeill, Director of Impressions Gallery. And before I introduce the four members of ReFramed, I have a couple of points to bring up. You've been muted on entry to this event, and can you please keep your mic switched off, as this will minimise background noise when the speakers are speaking. You can have your video switched on or off, it's up to you, but be aware we are recording this event for our archive, and it will be on our website as a future resource. This afternoon's session is 40 minutes long, with 30 minutes discussion with the four members of ReFramed. This will give you 10 minutes at the end to ask any questions you may have. The way we're doing the system today is you can post your question using the chat function. Thank you. While this is a new challenge for us to present our photo book fair and all its events online, it's also a fantastic opportunity for more people to join us and to welcome more people from all around the world. So welcome. This discussion is part of the Photo Book Fair's wider programme of talks and discussions with international photographers, artists and publishers throughout the day here on Zoom and also over on Instagram Live. On our website, there is a selection of 42 self-published books curated from an international open call-out. There are also other publishers, including Blue Coat Press, Overlaps, Schilt, Milder Books and Oath. Again, we'll be putting a link to our website on the chat. Right, great. This year's theme of the Photo Book Fair is photo activism. And the theme is a reflection on the important role photography can and has played in social change throughout history. Photography is a powerful tool for connecting us and communicating about our times, and perhaps in a year where it is more relevant than ever, we are focusing on the importance of working together whilst highlighting books and narratives that are influenced by race, history, gender and aesthetics. So on to the main event now. I am really, really pleased to welcome ReFramed. ReFramed is a Midlands-based photography network for Black, Asian and people of colour. And ReFramed was established by Andrew Jackson, Anand Chhabra, Sebah Chaudhry and Jagdish Patel. So excuse me everyone, I just need to take a glass of water. Sorry about that. Jagdish Patel and Sebah Chaudhry. Welcome, thank you so much, and it's really, really great that you can join us today. They are a team of award-winning photographers and curators who believe that visual arts can play a critical role in shaping civic and contemporary attitudes. ReFramed was formed to create opportunities and networks for racialized communities traditionally excluded from photography. Currently, ReFramed, one of the things they are working on is focused on creating platforms for practitioners from a cross-section of experiences to use photography to respond to the ways in which COVID-19 is directly impacting on them and their communities. I will now hand over to Sebah, who's chairing the conversation on activism and publishing. Thank you for joining us and enjoy.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne and Jane, for inviting us today. We're really happy to be here. So my colleagues Andrew and Anand and Jagdish will all present for 7 to 10 minutes, and after that we'll have a little chat. So Andrew's going to go first, so I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess I got into photography with perhaps kind of a very naive idea that I could somehow, I guess, counteract or counter some of the negative ways I'd seen images of people who look like me being represented in the media. I also had a kind of a naive idea that I was going to be a war photographer also. I guess, you know, I grew up in an age where before political correctness and before where everything was just a joke, mate, calm down. And that era where, you know, the primetime Saturday night TV was still the black and white minstrel. So I'm just placing a context for my kind of early days. And I guess as Eddie kind of Chambers has discussed quite very welcomely about my work, the ways in which racialized people have historically been represented within photography within the UK has been problematic, none the least. And I guess I had a perception that I could somehow counter, as I mentioned, those kind of perceptions. And it's kind of sad if you think in one sense that my work is seen as activism, when all that I'm doing in one sense is just showing people in ways in which their lived experience has proved for them to live. And I kind of, if I'm seen as an activist just by simply showing the ways in which people see themselves to exist, well, what do you call the other works? You know, what do you call the other works which continue to perpetrate stereotypical representations of people? Works by people who haven't really engaged or have the lived experience of communities. How would you describe that work? And perhaps on one level, you could, you know, talk about ideas of those works being just another cog in a wheel of structural kind of racism. So I guess I was interested in showing kind of Black identities in a range of perspectives. And I had the opportunity, I guess, to travel, to undertake, have experiences and try and conduct photographic representations. And I guess the one thing that we all have to think about is the idea that our work is a political act. The photography is a political act. It's never a benign. It's always charged with meaning. And even if you are taking images with one socially engaged or socially conscious meaning, when the work is put out there, those intentions might not come across, I guess. And so I guess one of the first works which I saw when I was quite early in my photographic practice was a work by the photographer Nick Hedges. And this really struck me in the sense that the representations which he was constructing of racialized people were, you know, humane. They were, you know, for the first time, as I remember seeing an image where a Black person and a white person are engaged in an emotional exchange. Usually, you know, as I mentioned, I was used to seeing images of Black bodies as props within photojournalism, within documentary, and Black bodies in a sense where they were used to create conversations, but not directed at the people in the frame. The photographer was having conversations with other people about the people within the frame. And I was lucky enough to study under Nick Hedges at Wolverhampton University in the 90s, and it was a, you know, when you're early in your kind of practice, to have the ability to talk to somebody who's done work which has kind of inspired you was a fantastic experience. And I know that another reason why I kind of was drawn to the work of Nick Hedges is that my parents worked in factories, and they'd come back with stories about, you know, both good and bad, but stories which I couldn't really conceptualize until I saw Nick Hedges' work. And he talks about, when he did the work in the late 70s, that, you know, factories and manual labor, industrial labor was seen as sites of dissent. And he didn't want to produce news images as such. He wanted to go inside and produce images of the everyday, you know, the kind of the epics of the everyday, those interpersonal human relationships which existed within people inside. And, you know, factories were those interesting places where cross sections of the community, Black, white, brown, etc., could interact, could develop friendships, could have shared experiences. And I guess I was kind of really kind of intrigued by this idea of, I guess, both representation and narrative, telling stories through images. And at this time, I was interested in working in, you know, the similar ways, kind of very kind of linear with an establishing shot, cutaways, your beginning, your middle, and your end. I remember him, this image always kind of stood out for me because he told us, the image, one of the students, that not long after this photograph was taken, this woman had committed suicide. And I always thought about this image, and I always thought about, you know, the idea of this kind of photograph being this vessel for feelings, for emotions, for, you know, stories in a sense. And I guess I was lucky enough to be moving on from the idea of emotions and feelings. I was lucky enough to be introduced to this book, The Sound I Saw by Roy de Carava, by Nick Hedges, also at my time at Wolverhampton University. And in one sense, where Nick Hedges was working in that traditional photojournalistic documentary way, you know, the images of telling, you know, being descriptive of what you could see in one sense. De Carava was interested in looking at the emotional aspects of photography. You know, the idea of documenting the space in which his music was born, and the connections between the space, the music, and the emotional responses created by both space, music, and the jazz musicians. And, you know, the images were this kind of interplay between the jazz musicians and the emotional reactions to that, but also to the spaces in which this music was born. And, you know, when I first saw this book, just the scale of the book, the size of the images, and the kind of connection between the music and the space, I kind of found intriguing. And it was just the sense that it was less about telling a story in a linear way than about trying to express these emotions, which I guess, you know, to be Black and American at the time of that time period, well, also this time period, you can imagine the stresses and strains and the emotional aspects of that, I guess. But there's something kind of which always kind of draws me back to this image. I still, you know, the idea that these are black and white images, and that's still kind of relevant to my early kind of practice. But there's another body of work which I guess most recently I did a work about my parents' migration from Jamaica to the UK. My parents declined into old age, and I started doing this work about my kind of parents initially, and how they came from Jamaica to work in the factories of the West Midlands of Dudley, and their emotional decline kind of referenced the kind of physical decline of the industry they came to work. But I was really kind of sadly, before I started the work, it was before my mom's decline into dementia. Paddy Summerfield was doing a work about his mother's decline into dementia, and this is before my mother's sad decline. But I was intrigued by, you know, the intimacy of these images. You know, we talk about activism, and activism doesn't always have to be about shouting, doesn't have to be about protest. Just the very act of documenting something at times and making things seen which aren't usually seen could be seen as an act of activism. And there was something, you know, deeply moving about this work. And I wrote a blog post about this book one time, and to Paddy Summerfield's great credit, somehow he read it. He sent me an email. It was really nice to, you know, get this this message from him. So, you know, that was a kind of an influence. I'm just going to round off to talk about a last kind of influence. And there's a book by Teju Cole called Blind Spot. And I think ultimately what I liked about this work was the idea of text and images. And, you know, the idea that either text and image not being interrelated to each other, not being dependent on each other, being enough in themselves in one sense to, you know, they diverge and they come together at aspects within the book. And it was something which kind of, I'm interested in exploring my own practice. I'm interested in the idea of using text, using narratives, using words as an interplay with images to again, both move the the narrative along, but also to ask questions about the images in myself. And I think that's where I'm going to end my presentation. There, seamless and fluid end, right there. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was really great insight. Some really great books that you shared there as well, and I'm sure people will be looking those up. Just remind everybody, if you like to ask Andrew any questions, put them in the chat and ask him at the end. Next up, we have Anand. You're on mute, Anand.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I'll start again. So this is Sebastião Salgado's work. It was the book that influenced me right at the beginning, I would say, of my foray into documentary photography. I was 17 at the time. I know I don't look it now. I just completed my A-levels and I didn't really know which direction to take. I think commercial, fashion, advertising didn't really grab me as something I wanted to do, and I wanted to continue. And then I was told that there was a documentary on the television about this photographer, and he was really working through these images at the time. And it was about an hour long or so, an omnibus documentary on the BBC. And that really gripped me. And I thought the penny kind of dropped, and this is the thing that I wanted to do with my life, was to become a photographer, you know, that tells people's plights, people's stories around the world. And you know, I had that kind of dreamlike notion and try to go on an adventure in terms of trying to do that. Sorry, the screen's not kind of working. So the images from his work were really kind of powerful. Thought, you know, he turned real world situations into art, which really kind of again registered with me in terms of telling the truth of those pictures very, very powerfully. And that rests people's attention, as art does. So armed with my first camera, I knocked on my mom's, when my mom was working on the factory, and the door, and I said, could I come and take pictures there? And they let me in. I also tried to get into my dad's factory, but they let me in at my mom's factory. And so armed with the camera, I tried to be like Sebastião Salgado, you know, just trying to go and document this factory. This factory had all Punjabi Indian workers in there, something that, you know, you rarely find now. But as Andrew was saying, my parents' generation were invited by the British government early on to fill up the labour shortages post-war. And this was kind of the legacy of it. This is right at the beginning of 1990, these pictures were taken, and it's in a factory that were making industrial mops that were used for polishing various sizes all around the factory. And I printed about 3 of these kind of portraits that you see in order to help me to get me onto a H&D documentary photography course in Manchester. And so that's the kind of influence that book had on me. I've got it with me right now, but it's too heavy just to pick up and show you and flip through those pictures. So this influence really continued in my life, you know, throughout the college years. I still focused on taking images around the industrial sites around Manchester. This was in a place called Joseph Adamson in Hyde, Manchester. And I was just trying to create these kind of stylized pictures of these people who were working there at the time. And what's interesting about these pictures now, looking back, I think within just a few short years after these were taken, I don't think you could get into a factory anywhere in the Western world to take pictures like a student. I didn't even have a hard hat or anything. And they welcomed me to come in there many, many times. I think none of this industry exists right there. It's all been knocked down and houses have been built on top of it. So to come back to Salgado, it's going to lock my screen up. So Salgado defines his work as a militant photography dedicated to the best comprehension of man. Over the decades, he has bestowed the greatest dignity on the most neglected among us. And this you can find in the opening cover of the book. this is how it defines Salgado. Okay, my screen's frozen. There you go. Right, so I think in the book, this is not a very good picture, but this is more of a detailed image of those 2 pages there. This is his very famous foray into a photo essay in the gold mines of Brazil that he took. He's a Brazilian himself. And, you know, this is quite of a famous story of his, but it brings to notion, it brings into question about notions about who represents who in these images. So I've got a quote here from John Edwin Mason. These images create false knowledge about backwardness, barbarity, or sensuality of their subjects and continue to be part and parcel of the visual culture of white supremacy. So I think what's true about connecting with that quote, because this subject is coming up again and again about people talking about who is responsible for taking whose image. I mean, Sebastião Salgado is a Brazilian, and he's taking these pictures, and to be fair to him, he's doing it in a very ethical way. If you dig a bit deeper, you'll find out that when he took these images, he really wanted to, you know, push forward the plight of the workers and the conditions that they were in. But again, it also brings to notion how we consume all these kind of images as well. A lot of the images that have been taken through decades by Western photographers, white photographers, parachuting themselves into these kind of areas full of black, Asian, black and brown bodies, and highlighting their kind of plight. So there's another quote that kind of helps me in understanding about who takes whose picture. John Edwin Mason says, "I'm by no means saying that white photographers can't make portraits that challenge the white supremacist gaze, but some have and some do." He said, but photographers of color, and by and large, are more likely to make images that subvert the white gaze. They do it by creating images that are rooted in the particular historical experiences of black and brown people. They create these new ways of seeing and knowing. So there's a lot of talk right now about, you know, who takes who kind of image, you know, should white people go into these kind of areas and just take images just for our consumption? I think it's a very good question to ask right now, and everybody's kind of debating this kind of questioning that's going on. So I'm totally kind of against when other white organizations I've seen even locally will hire the big artist in to come in, work with communities that they, number one, the community hasn't asked them to, you know, take images of them or be part of them. And, you know, in reality, they leave no legacy behind. So this image I'm introducing is the work that I completed with Black Country Visual Arts as director, redressing the fact that there were no images kept in any of the Black Country archives around the Midlands. And we want to readdress this fact by collecting over 2,000 images in 2 years. And the important thing to say is that we were involved in the community straight away. We set up a base archive space. You're looking at images within the gallery, the final exhibition, but we kind of created a dedicated archive space in the most densely populated area for the Punjabis, and started to build relationships with them about why archiving and preserving their heritage and history. And then after 2 years, we put on an exhibition, something that they could be wowed by and also begin to understand why it was important to give them representation within the city's gallery, where vast majority of Punjabis never go and they don't access these places, but to give them representation and make the exhibition about them and their history within the city. So we collected images from the 1960s to the 1980s, about 2,000 of them, and presented all the findings of how we researched it, the ephemera we collected, the way, how we scanned the images. And this left a really good impression upon the community in the sense that they begin to engage with the exhibition. You know, the exhibition itself was done on purpose to be an assault on their senses, something that they could interact with and engage with and talk to each other about and see themselves represented within the art gallery. And fortunately for us, word of mouth spread. Both all the schools, the universities, secondary schools, primary schools began to want to know more about the exhibition, wanted to attend it, and day groups and day center groups of the first generation of Punjabis came to see it in their droves. I think we had 27,000 visitors. There were 40,000 Punjabis in the city. It's the largest populace of Punjabis outside of Wolverhampton. And we also invade civic spaces like the Gurdwara in one sense. In Smethwick, it's the Britain's first ever Gurdwara. It's a huge space, and they're welcome to have an exhibition there as well. So we were able to reach the community. And the great thing was, you know, after the exhibition, people understood what we were trying to do in preserving their heritage and history through these images. You know, we had a vast number of images given to us. And this is the lesson we learned in the first case, that it's important to have a very good exhibition, something that draws the community in. It was a perfect place. There's 10,000 people that attend the exhibition, etc. And they begin to, you know, you leave a legacy behind in the sense that people always remember you. This was a recent image. I never asked anybody to give us any more images since lockdown, but somebody gave us this image of the gentleman, Sikh gentleman on the left of your pictures, sitting with two Pakistani gentlemen. And they are in quarantine with TB in a local hospital. And someone gave us the images again of this is Nirmal, who worked in a factory in Wolverhampton, but then was shipped over to train Nigerian factory workers on welding over there. So I just want to introduce very quickly this this image of this project that I'm doing, a more intimate story of my mother and father's migration from Punjab, India to the UK. And I'm just trying to explore this story in different various categories of photography, archiving, portraits, conceptual images to tell their story of their migration. This image was where the family would just right at the entrance gate of a huge population of Punjabis within the city of Wolverhampton. And a picture like that 30, 40 years ago would have caused a riot. It's a picture of a mixed race couple, Indian and white woman, which I found quite interesting. I just took in the last 5 years. And I'm also exploring the social, cultural, political history of the city as well, surrounding the time of my parents' migration. I think 1968 for some reason was across the world a time of protest. And this gentleman on the right, Enoch Powell, makes this famous, infamous rather, Rivers of Blood speech, which protests the mass migration of Black and Asian people into the city and into the country of the UK. These are protesters from Wolverhampton. And I want to start to manipulate these images because I think there's more to be done here in terms of trying to communicate to a new generation. And I'll swip past these two images and what they mean because of time. But I want to introduce Marcelo Brodsky's poetic. Sorry?
Let's try and wrap up now.
Yeah. I'm coming to the end now. This is Marcelo Brodsky's Poetics of Resistance. This is influencing the work that I'm doing. And it says that he's developed a unique poetics-based interaction of mostly journalistic and archival photographs and written annotations to activate personal and collective memory, to communicate a memory of resistance that may connect people across time and space, working at the crossroads between visual arts, poetry, and human activism. This is a picture of the Poor People's Campaign taken shortly after Martin Luther King was assassinated, something that he initiated. But I just love the way in his work that he's actually using art and bringing what was in the past to connect to today. So obviously this has tones of George Floyd. And I thought it was a very fascinating book in that what he's done is, again, land rights in Jamaica, dictatorship protests in South America. And I'll leave you with this quote: "Professionals of the image like me have the responsibility to positively shape the way we make use of them in our society." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anand. Sorry to rush you there. I'm just very aware that we have a very short time left. Jagdish, over to you.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna I might have less than 7 minutes, but I'm going to try and take you on a little journey of how we've developed ReFramed over the last few months. First thing to point out, I suppose we're all from the working class families in the Midlands, and we didn't really have art books in the house. We're a family. We come from families who are into learning, but certainly photography books weren't present. But we did have, when I was growing up at school, the teachers brought in the Sunday Times magazines, And the Sunday Times magazines, and the collaboration between the photographers and Harold Evans, who recently died, who was the editor of the Sunday Times, was an important influence on us, I think, in how we saw the world. It was one of the few ways of seeing the world differently. And this is an image of Bradford that Don McCullen took. These are images of Bradford. This is Don McCullen, who did some work in Uganda just before the Asians were kicked out of the country. So Don McCullen has always been a good place for me. I like the way he speaks about photography. I like the passion. I liked his understanding of class, and that spoke to me when I was growing up. We didn't really in the local library or anywhere in the school. I mean, I grew up in a school where no one could pronounce my name until I went to university, and I just assumed white people couldn't pronounce Indian names. But there wasn't anti-racism books around or anti-racism thinking, but I started to understand how the othering process, or how white power works, or how male privilege works through Simone de Beauvoir and feminist writings reacting to the gaze. Through that, I got introduced to John Berger. I like The Seventh Man because it was one of the first books which talked about migrant labour and European migrant labour, and the European migrants' experience is different to the one here. And even though John Berger is very sympathetic to race, and he is an activist in lots of senses, he was there when he won the Booker Prize. He gave his money to the Black Panther movement here. And he was on the board of the Institute of Race Relations in London for quite a long time. But there was something about the way they talked that didn't quite connect. And I think one of the things that we've tried to think about in ReFramed is how do we talk about that past history and how can we connect? One of the ways I've found is through, if you look at Simone de Beauvoir, there's a collection of French writers like Frantz Fanon who talked about the experience of race, but also Albert Camus, who talks about the white experience in Africa. And one of the books I read when I was younger was Camus' Outsider, which ends with the killing of a nameless Arab. And it's like that, even though that was quite an influence book for a lot of young youth, alienated young youth when I was growing up, it was uncomfortable. And I think I only come to terms with it recently when this book came out, which is The Mosul Investigation by Kamal Abdouab. And what he does, he continues the story of the French Arab through the lives of the fictional lives of his family, who are having to cope with the death of their family, of their brother. And he continues the story of what the impact of that death is. And I thought it was a really interesting way of literature in fiction reacting to Western writing. Another book that I quite liked was this one, which looked at how the state uses photography, particularly how they, in the early part of Indian colonialism, they use monuments and sites of monuments to talk about how white people were attacked and how monuments were attacked. Something that came out more recently that I really like is Uzeli's work, which talks about, it approaches photography not so much through a photograph, but through the encounter that the photograph creates. So it's slowly shifting what photography is about in terms of this author, and because a lot of photography is based on the authorship, and it shifts it onto the image and what that history resembles. For example, there's one of these famous pictures from the history of photography. This is a photograph that Felix Benito took in 1858, which is about the Indian Mutiny, and it's listed on the Imperial Museum as the first piece of war photography showing the dead. In reality, we know from the diaries of the English soldiers that they dug up the graves and they put the bones out. And it's actually a constructed photo, and they were horrified they're having to do this. But it begins a discussion about how photography begins in India and in colonialism. Magnum recently gave us the photographs of the negatives of Chris Steele Perkins, and this is an image Chris Steele Perkins took in Southall. And what we did is we used these photographs to start a conversation in the South community. We identified the people in the photographs, and we talked about what that encounter meant to them. and what that experience of what they went through in 1979. This is a period of time when the National Front was big. And there was a march in Southall against the National Front, which resulted in 359 people in the local community being arrested and one white school teacher being killed. So it's a powerful community event. Similar things happened in Bradford, Leicester, and West Bromwich as well. So we had a discussion in the local community about these photographs through this, and we tried to reimagine some of these things. So one of the images you see on the ReFramed website is this, which is part of the recreation we did in Southall last year. Another important work I like is Dayanti Singh, and Dayanti Singh's work, it sort of uses photography, but also thinks about how to present the pictures to the community or in galleries, and she creates sculptures with photography. She makes these little photo books, and I really like these photo books. One of the things that I find in photo books, I mean, I like having big chunky photo books to the house, but they're totally inaccessible to elders in our community. And I had this idea of using personal images from your house and recreating things that your granny could take around in a handbag. So when she stopped at the bus stop, she can go and show her family photos to her friends in this way. And we're trying to think of how photography is part of people's lives in a different way. Because, I mean, in Black communities and Asian communities, photography is very much part of everyday life. Yes, Yogathantam, hopefully I pronounced the name right, is a book of 7 books that he's making, which recreates the story of the Ramayana, which is a Indian story, very similar to the Odyssey, which is it's a religious text which tries to think about how good reigns over evil, but it's also about how intellect reigns over power. The story is distorted in modern day India by the Indian far right, who talk about it as one good power reigning over bad power, but actually it's about intellect versus power. And what he does is mixes stage photography with hand-colored photographs and text and collages. And it's that mixture of different styles I really like, because I think there is a limitation what you can do with documentary type photographs. And I think there is a tradition of how we've been photographing, which makes it difficult to react to sometimes. So I think the idea of mixing different styles together, I really like. So that was one of the lessons. And I think one of the things we're trying to do with ReFramed is talk about the legacy of art from non-Western places and how we are inheritors of that art and how we can use that art. A lot of the art narratives goes from the South to the West in a way. A lot of the canon is written in the West, so if you're an artist practicing in the South, you aspire to go to be recognised by the West. But we're talking about how to have that dialogue across borders in different ways as part of what we want to do in ReFramed. I've used some of those thinking in my own works. This is an exhibition called When the Snow Melts, which is about Muslim soldiers in the Second World War that we did in Nottingham. It was a long, the way I work is it's a long ongoing project, tend to be. And I engage in a long period of time engaging with the community. And I think the exhibition work that we do and is as important as the discussions we have in the community. So alongside the exhibitions, I always do long periods of time where we're engaging with the community. In art practice, that's called relational aesthetics, and it's a legitimate form of art creation in itself in some ways. But we try and think about how people can engage, and how people can think about doing something with using the image making as doing something different in a way. So in this exhibition, one of the things we did, for example, is we talked about the way food supply is used in wartime. And what the impact of that is in terms of citizenship now. So, we know that the Jewish community was starved in Germany, but the Indian people also starved in India. 4 million Indians died in the Bengal famine, which is something that recently came up in the Black Lives Matter discussions. And the issue of citizenship and rights is very much linked to how people are hungry nowadays. So we had this meal in a local venue where the Jewish community came together with the local Black community and the Asian community to have communal meals together. So it's like, so in this exhibition, these are long period of time projects. They started, this one took 3 years, and they're very much the discussions and encounters that we have with the community are built into the process. So just showing you how that period of time. That discussion we continued after the exhibition, and so one of the things we've set up from that is what we call the People's Pantry, and we've done over COVID, and we've been doing art classes in the community, mostly online, but sometimes we've been doing them in parks, and sometimes I've had to go and see people one-to-one because I find it difficult to be alone. But we've created a forum where people can get together and think about issues of well-being and isolation during this lockdown. We've worked with a food bank to provide food to place to people, and we've worked with the Nottingham Law Centre and an employment centre to think about, you know, benefits, advice, and other stuff. And the other thing we've done is we've worked with local young kids, and we've sort of recreated some of that. We've reused some of the pictures of the Second War, and there's if you look on my website, there's a piece of hip hop we've created from that, and that was partly in reaction to the whiteness of the VE Day celebrations. So part of what we want to do in ReFramed is connect with local communities and think about how we have those discussions, because we're very much part of it. We see ourselves being partly embedded and partly belonging to that communities. But it's not just about serious work. I mean, this is one of the books I really like is Gordon Parks' Areas in Silence, where he mixes photography with watercolor painting. So it's creating things for the sake of creating things, having fun with them. And this is he mixes poetry with his paintings, with photographs, and you know, what we are trying to do is create a forum where people can practice art. We're not like the Black Arts movement in the 80s, where only political are important. We are doing things for the sake of doing things, and we want to help people, the local communities, the local Black and Asian photographers, do work that's interesting to them, that speaks to them, and create a forum where they can think through those issues. So there you go.
Thank you, Jagdish. We have to wrap up now. Are you done?
Have I stopped sharing?
And anyway, great, thank you. You just stop sharing.
You don't have to wrap up. Time for one question, I think.
That's fine. We can do a few questions. I mean, wrap up the talks anyway.
Yeah.
So Malcolm said he's happy to hear us talking about photo activism as a more inclusive categorization. I really kind of agree in the quiet activism part, because Andrew, as you mentioned, activism is a very charged word. But it's nice to see that all the three of you, the works that you've showed, they all are they kind of do borderline activism in their own kind of way. Okay, so Nathan asked you, Andrew, how do you ensure your work is collaborative and participatory? Are there any particular methodologies you personally take to ensure this?
I guess, you know, the first methodology is to think about how would you feel if you were represented? How do you want to be represented in photographs? You know, but also I think, you know, essentially I'm telling stories about my own experience, my lived experience. If I'm doing a work about younger men living in a particular area of Birmingham, it also mirrors my experience of growing up and being young in Dudley. I think, you know, participation is an interchange, is an exchange. It's about dialogue. It's about people knowing what you're doing, knowing where the images are going to be seen, knowing that other people are going to be seeing these images too. And it's about, you know, that those permissions come from that. But I guess ultimately it comes down to treating people in the way that you want to be treated. And again, in one sense, I might be photographing a group of people who I'm not related to, but they have a shared experience of my own, and I think I feel them a duty of care within my images, which I make of them.
Thank you. So you all seem to be using photo archives as part of your work. As a question for Pippa, how important is it to do this, to reactivate or critique archives of historical photographs? Jagdish or Anand?
I think I'm using photo archives because I'm keen on telling untold stories and reflecting a people group that's totally been ignored up to now. So that's one sense of, if you want to reactivate, I think reactivating is more representing them in that respect. So it's important for their stories to come out. You know, when they came here, You know, how were they treated? How did they feel? I think all the images in our archive reveal some aspect of that untold story.
I think one of the things is when we look through the history of photography and particularly in community art, most of the work is by white artists, or most of the work are by white documentarians. A lot of the stuff that's been taken by black photographers has disappeared or not in the public domain openly. So it's easier to work with vernacular in some way, with photography and people's personal archives, because that's easier to find. And actually that does tell a different story to that presented by you know, a white photographer would certainly go into somewhere like Handsworth when there's a riot. So it tells a particular story. And it's one of the, you know, if you look at the films of like Handsworth songs or something, it's one of the debates that they have is, do you tell the story through the archives of the state or official circles, or do you tell the story through the archives of personal lives? And I think it's because we're starting from that base where a lot of things aren't in existence. It's partly why we're using personal narratives in that way.
I think we've got time for the last one. One last question.
Yep. Okay. Maurice has asked, do your communities now relate much more on Instagram, etc.? Do you tap into that now as a resource archive? This is pertinent now with COVID and less social interaction.
I would say yes for mine, because the Upton Heritage Archive, we have people logging on from all over the world in terms of viewing the archive that is online. And certainly on Instagram, it's given access to a younger generation who can find out more about the history of the first generation, and they're really enjoying that, I think. So I think it's very pertinent now. I think more people are looking at images and even buying books at this stage. So it becomes more pertinent with COVID, I think, for me.
Yeah, certainly with the work that we're doing with ReFramed, it's very much online, isn't it? Okay, can I just ask one more question? Why is ReFramed important at this time? As a member of ReFramed, I'm asking the rest of the members of ReFramed.
I would want to say that it's important because I think some of the things that we've been talking about, we're addressing, is it's had its roots really in colonialism, if you like, because you know how we've been perceived up to now. We've all got good qualifications. No one's ever asked us to be members of any kind of organization that represents photography. So I think that steeps itself from the origins of colonialism, where we are seen as inferior compared to white counterparts who are deemed to be superior, even within our own communities. So I think one of the things that Andrew points out, you know, if he goes into a black church, a white photographer is more able to access that community than he would be. That makes sense. So I think we need a group, an organization like ours to be able to represent photographers that are coming up, you know, to train them, to make them competent artists, curators, etc., for the future, that they can therefore show their skills to others in the future, and to represent those communities by the works that we do.
I think within photography, there's an idea of who is the credible source, who is the real observer, and that often isn't us in that description. And I think, you know, why ReFramed is important is because representation matters. And I think we all, you know, should have the ability to tell our own stories in ways in which we see them to exist. And if we don't tell our stories, other people will tell them for us, perhaps in ways in which we don't consider them to be representative of the lived experiences which we have, I guess.
I mean, one of the reasons I mean, we need a forum for us to be able to talk amongst ourselves as one, but I've been engaged in discussions around the black art canon generally for a few years. And I know in the art painting, there's much more recognition of black artists, much more recognition that there is a history of black art painting which equals that of Western painting. And I don't think black photographers have been treated equally in that respect. And I think there's a need to think about how the history of black photography fits into the photography history. And I think part of what we're doing is addressing that issue. That issue requires a lot of bit more research and things like that, but we're part of thinking about how Black image making fits into the history, which doesn't get, because it's not taught in the college schools and colleges and the universities. There's hardly any Black photography teachers in any of the universities, as far as I know, and certainly none of that work really appears on the curriculum. And when Black students talk about this and what it means to them, they a lot of time get asked to think about, what does it mean to you? They don't get asked to, why don't you look at the police surveillance reports, images, or why don't you look at how the state's done this in the past? And I think we're just slightly bringing a slightly different angle and a slightly different way of doing things. Really, it's part of what we're doing.
Thank you. I took some notes during your talk, and I'll tell you why I think ReFrame's important. Sort of picking out just 3 points, 1 point from each of you. Jagdish, you said, how do we talk about past history and the experience of race? And I think that is something that you should be bringing up. And it was really, really interesting that you've asked that question to us. And Andrew, you said photography is a political act. It is never benign. I think that's really, really something that everybody should be thinking about. And I mean, you all said amazing things as well, and these were just things that I picked out during your talk. And Anand, it was really great that you had quotes from the brilliant John Edward Mason. If people don't know him, look up his writings. He's really intelligent take on representation and race. And the one thing that you said that was really interesting for me is, who's responsible for taking whose image and how are they then consumed? And then you all said at the end, representation matters. So thank you very much for joining us today as part of Activism and Publishing. This event is just part of a whole lot of events. Over on our website, you'll see stalls by our self-publishers. There'll be, as I mentioned, the publishers. To go over onto the website, I think Angela might be putting it on the chat. I'd like to thank our funders for making today possible. That's the Arts Council of England and Bradford Council. One other thing is, I've been asked by Angela to pass on to people who are at this talk today, if you've got 5 minutes at the end, please can you fill in our digital survey. It'll help us inform what we're doing right, what we could do better, help formulate future plans. The next thing is, our Instagram live talks are still happening. Check the website for the times. And the next meeting at Zoom will be 3 o'clock with the New York curator Antoine Sargent and our very own Pippa Oldfield. All that's left for me to see now is thank you so much, you guys. Really, really great. And I'm privileged that you could join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.